Good. Well, thank you very much for that introduction. And so I'm going to talk about this study which was completed in 2018, the State of the British Coast study. And essentially, this is looking at how historical artworks can inform us about, inform science about long-term coastal change. And I wanted to acknowledge actually my co-author, Chloe Stanford Clark, who I think is actually watching today from the University of Montpellier, where she's doing her PhD. So on that note, can we move to the first slide, please? So back in 2007, I was walking through Tate Britain and I stopped to have a look at this oil painting by the Pre-Raphaelite artist William Dyce of Pegwell Bay in Kent. And I was very struck by the extraordinary detail, the way that the chalk cliffline had been depicted, and the geology of the foreshore and the groins and so on, and the beach. And I wondered if this was actually a true depiction of what that part of the coastline looked like in 1858, or was there an element of artistic license and just essentially a pretty picture was produced. And seeing this, it made me wonder how many other paintings there might be of the coastline of Great Britain that might possibly be of use to inform us of the changing British coast in full colour, extending back to the late 18th century and long before the introduction of even black and white photography. So in the next slide, I think I can show you another example. And here's a rather nice watercolour by Charles Napier Hemy among the shingles at Clovelly. And again, you can see the extraordinary detail in which the beach is captured, and the signs of failure in the cliffs and details of the property located on the shore. And in the following image, here's another one, Tantallon Castle on the North Berwickshire coast by John Sire, who, this is in oils this time, and but again, a very detailed view of the coast, as well as the castle there on the cliff tops. And then if we move on, one of these amazing paintings by the Pre-Raphaelite follower John Brett of the Lizard in Cornwall, and he produced these magnificent geological paintings, particularly around the coastline of southwest England and Wales, and a few in Scotland, and they're almost photographic in quality. But I was able to take this work forward, thankfully, in the next slide, through a fellowship which I was very kindly awarded by the Crown Estate Caird Fellowship, which is the National Maritime Museum in the Crown Estate, and for a preliminary study looking at the potential use of art for the Hampshire and Isle of Wight coastlines. And having completed that, very much a pilot study, the Crown Estate took this forward and asked me to produce a series of these reports, which covered initially East Anglia, where there were obviously a lot of issues with erosion and cliff instability and flooding, and then after that, England, Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland. And each of these reports, they are available online, and they're on my Coastal and Geotechnical Services website. You can download them all, and they're about 80 or 90 pages each. So if we could move on to the next slide, one of the key issues is, are these paintings accurate or not? And how can we determine which artist painted most accurately? So over the years, I've developed a ranking system with 4 main strands, and this has been steadily refined over the years, and really looking at perhaps the accuracy of the artistic style. I mean, different styles through time have been influenced by taste, and so I assigned scores for each of these, and then also looked at the choice of medium, because it's possible to obtain a much greater level of detail in some mediums compared with others. For example, generally you can get more detail in steel engravings than you can in copperplate, and perhaps even more so in lithographs. And sometimes, or perhaps in most cases, watercolour drawings provide us the most detailed images. And then, of course, the content of the artwork. What does it actually tell us? Is it a general view of the coastline, a view perhaps from further out to sea? Does it show the shape of the beach and allow us to consider how the beach might have changed and how it became developed over time. Remember, some of these artists, they repeatedly returned to the same spot to paint, so sometimes you can get quite a good chronology like that. And then the time period actually as well, because obviously the early ones before the days of photography are particularly important in terms of looking at what the coastline was like, often before the original esplanades and coastal defences were put in place. So if, for example, as is happening around the British coast nowadays, in certain places coastal defences are being removed, art can perhaps give you an indication of what one might expect conditions to revert to over time. And then in the next slide, in terms of helping us with this study, well, this is what I was really looking at. What can we understand from art looking back really nearly over 250 years, from the mid to the late 18th century? And to what extent does the art record tell us about not just physical landscapes, but the environments of the coastal zones, and also cultural heritage? Have they been affected by both natural processes such as erosion and flooding and landslip, but also human influences over time? Now, we do have quite sophisticated technologies in place now for monitoring the coastal change, but many of these, there's very few parts of the country where any systematic monitoring goes back more than about 30 or 40 years. So if we can, through art, look back 2 centuries or more, then obviously this is going to provide a much better understanding of how the coastlines evolved over a much longer time period. So on the next slide, how many paintings are there, and what are the resources available? Well, obviously there are huge numbers of paintings, oil paintings and watercolours in both public and private collections. The Public Catalogues Foundation, inspiration of Dr. Fred Holer, he arranged the photographing of all the, or nearly all the oil paintings in public collections in Great Britain. These are now on the Art UK website. And in 2019, Watercolour World was launched, again by Mr. Holer, starting to do the same thing with the estimated 6 million watercolours in public and private collections spanning this long period from 1600 to 1900. So as more and more of these images become available online, often for the first time, we can make very good use of them, I think, for this kind of research, and indeed many other areas. So in terms of, if we can move on a slide, and then we can just flip through, certain artists made great topographic tours, such as William Daniel's voyage around Great Britain in the early 19th century, with 308 wonderful aquatint engravings, such as this view of the Needles on the Isle of Wight, illustrated in his book. And generally he was pretty accurate in terms of his early depictions of the coast. And then just as another image on that slide, the artist and architect David Adday, the Martin Gregory Gallery, suggested he might retrace William Daniel's footsteps in the 1990s. It took him another 10 years and paint the present day view from the same vantage spot as Daniel had chosen, or as near as possible. So that provides a very interesting comparison. But there were many other artists who we could draw upon as well. And in the next slide, for example, it shows how those artists with a bit of architectural background, this is St. Maur's Castle, you can see, I think he's caught it rather well in terms of allowing us to understand, well, it doesn't appear to be a great deal of change there. And that's just as important as a lot of change or only a medium amount. And then on the next slide, the pre-Raphaelites and their followers produced these amazing coastal paintings. Probably the greatest coastal painter was Edward William Cook, RA. Here's his view of Bonchurch on the Isle of Wight, where he painted over 50 large canvases over his lifetime. And I think if we just click through, we can see the kind of detail which shows the cliffs in geology extraordinarily well, the coast protection structures and the beach and so on. So that's the kind of artist who is really extremely useful. And then if we just, we can have another look at Cook down at Beer on the South Devon coast. And you can see the coastline there. And then if we again move in a bit closer on that one, there's another image.
Oh dear, ooh.
Have you got another one?
It's not letting me go forward. Let me
Oh, right.
There we go.
Yes, so you can see the little white bit of the cliff at the top on the right in Cook's painting, and then it's in the photograph in the top left. And then if we move closer in on that, I think if it clicks again, you can see that. So that's the actual geology of the cliff. And you can see, I think, how well that Cook has depicted the scene in 1858. So incredibly detailed and almost as good as the photograph. And then if we just move on and we can see some other examples, well, here's Holman Hunt's view of Asparagus Island in Kynance Cove on the Cornish coast. And a couple more, perhaps from an environmental point of view, Henry Moore, another pre-Raphaelite follower. Look at his wonderful depiction of the Lundy coast with showing the bird species and the habitats there. And one more, I think. Yes, so Hugh Payton's view, a wonderful Scottish artist of Arros on Mull. So we've got this very rich art resource that can help us understand more about the coast. And this is just a fraction of thousands of examples, of course. So moving to the next slide, what can we do with this? Well, initially I was particularly interested in coastal management and planning. So art can help us understand more about the long-term coastal change, how coastal evolution has taken place and at what rate and scale is it taking place. We can understand the chronology of coastal defences, for example, when they were built and at what time and what their influence was. And we can understand changing patterns of coastal development over the last 200 years. And in the next slide, a bit more about that. So really art can inform very well nature and earth science conservation if we're interested in long-term environmental change and habitats and species change, gains and losses over time. So those who are interested in planning, producing landscape character assessments, which are required for many AONBs and national parks, and to support countryside management. And then also heritage and culture. I did a study again with my colleague Chloe for historic England on the southwest counties of England, looking at how art depicted risks to coastal heritage sites. So again, art can inform, for example, the preparation of historical environment records and raise awareness of local and regional art history, what museums and galleries have. It's a new strand of resource that can be made use of, and really essentially just bridging science and art. In the next slide, I'm just going to show you another example from the Isle of Wight, because the south coast of the Isle of Wight, centred on Ventnor, is the largest urban landslide complex in northwestern Europe. So this steel engraving by William Westall shows the landscape in the early times of the development of Ventnor, and you can see fairly well all the detail of the landslip, some of which is set out in the quay. Well, now, of course, nearly the whole of the town has been masked by development, and the downs are covered in evergreen oak trees. So it's only by using this historical image you can look back and really understand the formation of this particular landslide system. And when the former DOE carried out a major study here on landslip potential in 1990, they were able to make good use of images such as this to improve their understanding. So if we can just look at a few recommendations here. So, and these are drawn from the report, State of the British Coast. So really it's saying we do have a very important and currently underused art record, which is becoming increasingly available now, and that much greater use could be made of these resources to support a whole range of coastal and environmental studies. And the fact that we've got this wonderful collection on the Art UK website, and Watercolour World, which is rapidly increasing as they photograph more and more collections the whole time. And also through this research, the preparation of a list of those British coastal artists who painted most accurately. Having this list makes it much easier for people to identify artists from their particular area without doing their own very time-consuming research into trying to find who painted accurately or otherwise. So for each coastal frontage around Great Britain, a list's been provided of those artists who painted the scenery of that particular geographical region most accurately. And then one more on the recommendations. So yes, there's a great deal of information that can be helpful to coastal planners and managers in particular, I think, in terms of when structure and county plans are drawn up, but also, for example, if boundaries and plans of conservation areas are being produced, and looking at changes that have taken place, buildings that have been lost over time or how they've been altered, that can also be very interesting. There's artists such as Alfred Robert Quinton, who was a very prolific producer of colour picture postcard art. He did over 6,000 coastal views around England and Wales between 1900 and 1934. And he often visited the same resorts as they developed, as many as 10 times. So they're a wonderful resource, and they're painted in great detail. So as I mentioned earlier, where local authorities may be thinking about removing existing coastal defences for environmental reasons or managed realignment, as it's called, the art record can be a valuable source of information looking at how the coastline might return to a more natural condition. And finally on this, that obviously taking away coastal defences, for example, or changing coastal policy is a very sensitive subject for those who live near the coast. But rather than a lot of scientific data, people do, I think, have an affinity and understanding looking at works of art of the coast, and they're more amenable to understanding the changes that might take place in the future as a result of climate change and sea level rise, if we look through time at through a succession of artworks which very clearly illustrate how the coastlines changed over that time. So finally, I just wanted to acknowledge those people in the last slide who've helped with this particular study. And so there's a mixture of art-related organisations, auction houses, and scientific institutions and bodies. So that was all very gratefully received. And the full report is available. I should have put it on my slide at www.coastalandgeotechnical.services, which is all one word, .com. And so do please take the opportunity to have a look at that. Thank you very much.